He thought firing her would be the easiest decision of his career, but within minutes, he would realize he had just erased his own future. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or state in the comments below, and if you believe dignity always finds its way back, stay with this story. Now, back to Clara Whitmore. The conference room on the 42nd floor of Brooks Financial Group gleamed under soft white lighting, a long glass table stretching across polished marble floors that reflected every movement like a silent witness. Outside, Manhattan pulsed with late-morning traffic, yellow cabs threading through steel and glass. But inside this room, everything felt controlled, curated, and cold. Executives in tailored navy suits and crisp blouses filled the seats, their voices low, confident, and practiced, the kind of tone that came from years of believing they belonged at the top. And then there was Clara. She sat near the end of the table, almost outside the circle of influence, her gray cardigan simple, her notebook neatly aligned with the edge of the glass. Her presence so quiet it was as if the room had already decided she didn't matter. Her dark hair was tied back without effort, her posture straight but unassuming, her eyes steady in a way that didn't match the role everyone had assigned to her. Daniel Brooks stood at the head of the table, commanding the room without raising his voice, his tailored charcoal suit fitting him like authority itself, his silver watch catching the light with every small gesture. He had built his reputation on precision, on control, on knowing exactly who belonged in his world and who didn't. And this morning, his gaze kept drifting back to Clara with a faint irritation he didn't bother to hide. "Let's get this moving," he said, tapping the table once, the sound echoing sharper than it should have. Conversations died instantly. A hush fell. Clara didn't look up right away. She finished writing a note, closed her pen, and only then lifted her eyes, calm and unreadable. Around her, a few executives exchanged subtle glances, the kind that carried quiet judgment. She didn't fit the image. She didn't speak like them, dress like them, or move like someone chasing approval. And in a room built on hierarchy, that made her an easy target. Daniel flipped through a set of printed reports, his expression tightening as he reached a page he clearly didn't like. "Clara," he said, her name landing in the room like a spotlight she never asked for. A few heads turned immediately, curiosity flickering. "You prepared this analysis?" His tone wasn't a question. It was a setup. Clara met his gaze, steady, unflinching. "Yes." A pause stretched just long enough to feel intentional. Daniel leaned back slightly, exhaling through his nose as if disappointed before she had even spoken another word. "Interesting," he murmured, though there was no interest in it at all. The room shifted subtly, the air tightening, anticipation building in the quiet spaces between breaths. Somewhere near the middle of the table, someone cleared their throat. Another glanced down, pretending to read. Clara didn't move. Her hands rested lightly on the table, fingers still, her composure untouched by the tension rising around her. And for a brief second, almost too quick to notice, there was something in her eyes that didn't match the role they had given her. Not fear, not uncertainty, something quieter, something certain. And as Daniel prepared to speak again, convinced he was about to put her in her place, the room leaned in without realizing they were about to witness something none of them could undo. The air held still. The moment hovered. And somewhere beneath the polished surface of power, the balance had already begun to shift. Daniel let the silence stretch just long enough to make it uncomfortable, his fingers tapping once more against the glass table, as if measuring how far he could push before anyone dared to interrupt him. "I have to say," he began, lifting the report slightly between two fingers, "this is not what I expect from someone in this room." A faint murmur rippled across the table, subtle but unmistakable, like a current passing through still water. Clara remained still, her gaze steady, her expression unchanged, as though his words had not landed where he intended. Daniel took a slow step forward, circling slightly so that every eye followed him, every angle of the room reinforcing his control. "We are dealing with high-level projections here," he continued, his tone calm, but edged with quiet superiority. "Not entry-level interpretations." A few executives lowered their eyes, some out of discomfort, others to hide the flicker of agreement they did not want to say. Out loud, someone near the middle of the table let out a soft breath that almost sounded like a restrained laugh. Clara heard it. She heard all of it, but she did not react. Her hands remained folded neatly, her posture unchanged, her presence almost unnervingly composed. Daniel stopped walking and faced her directly now, placing the report back onto the table with a deliberate, audible slide. "Tell me," he said, his voice dropping slightly, forcing the room to lean in. "What exactly was your thought process here?" The question was not meant to invite explanation. It was meant to expose. A pause followed, long enough that even the air seemed to hesitate. Clara glanced down briefly at the document, then back up at him. "It is based on long-term asset consolidation across subsidiaries," she said, her voice calm, measured, and unexpectedly clear. The precision of her answer created a small disruption in the room, a shift that could be felt more than seen. Daniel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He had expected hesitation, uncertainty. Not this. He gave a short, humorless smile. "Across subsidiaries," he repeated, as if testing the words for weakness. "That would require access to data you do not have." Another ripple, this time sharper. A few heads turned more openly now, interest replacing dismissal. Clara did not look away. "Not publicly," she replied. The words landed softly, but they did not disappear. They lingered. For a fraction of a second, something flickered across Daniel's face, too quick for most to catch, but enough to register that the script he had planned was not unfolding exactly as expected. He straightened his posture, reclaiming the moment with a sharper edge. "Let me be very clear," he said, his voice rising just enough to reassert control. "This level of speculation is not only inappropriate, it is a liability." The word liability hung heavy in the air, drawing a line between belonging and exclusion. Clara's fingers shifted slightly on the table, the only movement she had made so far. She inhaled quietly, then exhaled, as if settling something within herself rather than responding to him. Around her, the room had grown still again, but it was a different kind of stillness now. Less dismissive, more watchful. Daniel took that stillness as permission. Effective immediately, he continued, his tone firm. "Final, you are no longer part of this team." The words landed cleanly, like a decision already signed and sealed before anyone else could question it. A few people exchanged glances, some surprised, others not at all. One executive shifted uncomfortably in their seat. Another looked down, avoiding Clara entirely. And yet, she did not move. She did not speak. She did not even blink right away. She simply sat there, absorbing the moment without resistance, without protest, as though something far larger than this room had already been decided. The silence that followed was not empty. It was waiting. And no one in that room realized yet that the quiet woman they had just dismissed was the only person who had never been uncertain about how this moment would end. For a moment, no one spoke, as if the decision that had just been delivered needed time to settle into something real. Clara remained seated, her eyes lowering briefly to the glass surface of the table where her reflection stared back at her, calm, composed, untouched by the finality in Daniel's voice. Around her, chairs shifted softly, papers were adjusted, and a few executives began to look away, already distancing themselves from someone who no longer belonged in the room. That was how it worked here. You were included until you were not. Clara placed her pen carefully on top of her notebook, aligning it with quiet precision, a small action that seemed almost out of place in a moment meant to humiliate her. Then she stood. The movement was unhurried, smooth, deliberate, drawing just enough attention to interrupt the quiet dispersal that had begun. Daniel watched her with a faint expression of impatience, expecting resistance, perhaps even a last attempt to defend herself. Instead, Clara simply adjusted the sleeve of her cardigan and looked directly at him, her gaze steady in a way that felt increasingly difficult to ignore. "Understood," she said softly. "No argument. No plea. Just acceptance." It should have ended there. It should have been simple. But something in the way she said it caused a subtle shift in the room, a hesitation that no one could quite explain. Clara reached for her phone, the device resting neatly beside her notebook, and picked it up with the same quiet control she had shown from the beginning. Several people noticed now. Conversations that had started in whispers faded again. Daniel's eyes narrowed slightly, irritation flickering back to the surface. "If you have personal matters to attend to, you can do that outside," he said, his tone clipped, eager to close the moment and move on. Clara did not look away from him. She did not respond to the instruction. Instead, she unlocked her phone, her thumb moving once across the screen, and raised it to her ear. The room held still. "Yes," she said, her voice calm, almost detached. A pause followed, as though she were listening to something only she could hear. "Please proceed." That was all. No explanation. No elaboration. Just two words delivered with quiet certainty. She lowered the phone and placed it back on the table. For a second, nothing happened. Daniel let out a small breath, almost amused now, shaking his head slightly, as if confirming what he had already decided about her. "This is exactly the kind of unprofessional behavior I was referring to," he said, turning away from her as though she no longer deserved his attention. A few people nodded faintly, relieved to return to familiar ground. The structure was restoring itself. Control was back where it belonged. Or at least, that was what they believed. Then, a soft chime broke through the room. One device, then another, then several more, each notification echoing in quick succession, sharp against the silence. Heads lifted, eyes dropped to screens, brows furrowed. Someone inhaled sharply. The rhythm of the room changed in an instant, like a current reversing direction without warning. Daniel paused mid-movement, his hand still resting against the back of his chair, as the first flicker of uncertainty crossed his face. He reached into his pocket, pulling out his phone, his confidence still intact, but no longer absolute. Around the table, expressions shifted from mild curiosity to something else entirely. Confusion, recognition, and then something closer to disbelief. The air tightened again, but this time it did not belong to him. It belonged to whatever had just been set in motion by the quiet woman who had already turned away from the table, her steps measured, unhurried, as though she had nowhere to rush because she had never been the one out of control. Behind her, the room was no longer settling. It was unraveling, and no one could stop reading what had just appeared on their screens. The glow of phone screens cast a cold, unfamiliar light. Across the polished table, reflecting in eyes that had just minutes ago been filled with quiet confidence. Now those same eyes scanned rapidly, scrolling, rereading, as if hoping the words would rearrange themselves into something less impossible. They did not. Clara had almost reached the door when the first voice broke the silence, low and uncertain. "This has to be a mistake." Another voice followed, sharper, edged with disbelief. "No, this came from corporate legal." Chairs shifted more abruptly now, the controlled composure of the room dissolving into something unsteady. Daniel's gaze locked onto his phone, his thumb scrolling once, then again, slower this time, as if clarity might appear with patience. It did not. The message was concise, unmistakable, and stamped with authority that outranked every person in that room. Effective immediately, all executive authority was subject to review under majority ownership directive. His jaw tightened, but not with the same certainty as before. Something else had taken its place. Something closer to realization, though he had not fully allowed himself to name it yet. "What is this?" he demanded, his voice no longer smooth, no longer controlled in the way it had been moments ago. No one answered, not because they did not want to, but because they were still trying to understand what they were seeing. A woman near the center of the table lifted her eyes slowly from her screen, her expression pale. "Daniel, this is signed." The word sign hung heavier than anything else. Sign meant verified. Sign meant real. Sign meant irreversible. Clara stopped just short of the door, her hand resting lightly on the handle, not turning it yet. She did not look back immediately. She allowed the silence to stretch, to deepen, to settle into every corner of the room that had so quickly dismissed her. Behind her, the soft hum of the city outside felt distant now, replaced entirely by the quiet unraveling of authority inside. Daniel took a step forward, then another, his attention no longer on the table, no longer on the room, but fixed entirely on the figure standing at the door. "Clara," he said, her name carrying a different weight this time, no longer dismissive, but searching, uncertain. She turned slowly. Her expression had not changed, but the room saw her differently now. Or perhaps, for the first time, they were seeing her at all. "You knew about this," he said, not quite a question, not quite a statement, his voice caught somewhere between both. Clara held his gaze, calm and steady. I approved it, she replied. The words did not rise. They did not push. They simply existed, and in doing so, they shifted everything. A sharp intake of breath echoed from somewhere near the far end of the table. Someone's phone slipped slightly against the glass surface with a faint, jarring sound. The pieces that had not fit before began to align, each one falling into place with quiet, undeniable precision. Majority ownership, executive authority, legal directive. The room understood now, though none of them wanted to. Daniel's expression changed in a way that could not be hidden, the certainty that had defined him replaced by something far less stable. That is not possible, he said, but the words lacked force, as if even he did not believe them. Clara stepped away from the door, not leaving, not yet. Her presence filled the space differently now, no longer overlooked, no longer dismissed. It has already been filed, she said, her tone even, unshaken. Effective this morning. The room went completely still. No one moved. No one spoke. Because in that moment, the truth settled in with quiet finality. The woman they had just removed from the room had never been beneath them. She had been above them all along. The silence did not break all at once. It fractured, piece by piece, as the weight of her words settled into every corner of the room. Daniel stood motionless for a second too long, his hand still gripping his phone, his mind trying to catch up to a reality that no longer followed his rules. Around the table, executives who had once leaned back in quiet confidence now leaned forward, their expressions tightening, their posture shifting as if the air itself had changed direction. Authority had moved, and they could feel it even before they fully understood it. Clara took a step back toward the table, not reclaiming space with force, but simply existing within it differently now, her presence no longer optional, no longer ignorable. Majority ownership, someone whispered under their breath, as if saying it softly might make it less real. Another voice followed, quieter still. That means, but the sentence never finished, because it did not need to. Everyone knew what it meant. Daniel finally lowered his phone, though his grip did not loosen. You are saying, he began slowly, choosing each word with care, that you have controlling interest in this company. The room watched him now, not as a leader, but as a man trying to hold on to something already slipping away. Clara met his gaze without hesitation. Not just this company, she said calmly. The parent group. The words landed without emphasis, but they echoed louder than anything else that had been said that morning. A visible reaction rippled through the room, sharper this time, impossible to contain. One executive straightened abruptly in their chair. Another exhaled as if they had been holding their breath for minutes. The structure they had trusted, the hierarchy they had relied on, had just been rewritten in a single sentence. Daniel's composure cracked, not loudly, not dramatically, but in the smallest ways that mattered most. The tight control in his posture loosened, his shoulders dropping just slightly, his voice losing that precise edge it once carried. Why would you not disclose that? He asked, the question no longer accusatory, but searching, almost defensive. Clara did not answer immediately. She let the question exist in the space between them, let it reveal more about him than it required from her. Then she spoke, her voice even, unhurried, because it was never required. The simplicity of the answer left no room for argument. No justification. No apology. Just truth. A quiet shifted across the room again, but this time it was not confusion. It was recognition. The realization that everything they had assumed about her had been built on nothing more than surface judgment. Daniel took another step forward, but this time it was not to dominate the space. It was to close a distance he had created without realizing it. Clara, he said, her name careful now, measured. There must have been a misunderstanding earlier. The words felt fragile, like something being constructed in real time without a foundation strong enough to hold. Clara's eyes did not harden, but they did not soften either. They remained steady, grounded in something far beyond the moment. No, she said quietly. There was not. The finality in her tone did not rise in volume, but it settled deeper than any raised voice could have. Around them, no one moved. No one interrupted, because they understood now that the moment they had witnessed earlier was not a misunderstanding. It had been a revelation, and now, the consequences were beginning to take shape. Clara glanced briefly at the table, at the same seats that had moments ago dismissed her, then back at Daniel. You made a decision, she said. Now I will make mine. The room went completely still again, not out of habit this time, but out of something closer to anticipation. Because for the first time that morning, everyone understood exactly where the real power had been all along. Daniel did not respond immediately, and that hesitation spoke louder than anything he could have said, because for the first time since he had walked into that room, he no longer controlled the pace of what came next. Clara stood where she was, composed, unshaken, as if the outcome had already been written long before this meeting had ever begun. Around the table, eyes shifted between them, no longer searching for cues from Daniel, but waiting for Clara, measuring her silence as if it now carried the authority the room instinctively followed. She took a slow step forward, not to confront, but to reclaim a space that had never truly been taken from her. The soft echo of her heels against the marble floor cut cleanly through the tension, each step deliberate, unhurried, impossible to ignore. When she reached the center of the table, she stopped, placing one hand lightly against the glass surface, grounding herself not in power, but in certainty. Effective immediately, she said, her voice calm and steady, carrying without force. All executive decisions made within the last 48 hours are under review. The words were simple, but they landed with weight that pressed into every person in the room. A few executives straightened instinctively. Others glanced down at their screens again, as if hoping for clarification that would soften what they had just heard. There was none. Clara's gaze moved briefly across the room, not lingering, not judging, simply acknowledging what was there before returning to Daniel. Including personnel decisions, she added, her tone unchanged. The implication did not need to be explained. Daniel's lips parted slightly, as if to speak, but no words came immediately. The certainty that had once defined him had been replaced by calculation, by the quiet realization that every response now carried consequences he could no longer predict. Clara, he began, his voice lower, more careful than before. We can discuss this privately. It was an attempt to regain control, to move the moment away from witnesses, away from the shift that had already taken place in front of everyone. Clara did not move. There is nothing to discuss privately, she replied, her words even, final, leaving no space for negotiation. A hush fell again, deeper this time, not the kind that waited for direction, but the kind that understood something irreversible had already occurred. Clara reached for her notebook, closing it with quiet precision, then set it aside as though marking the end of something that no longer needed to be carried forward. You evaluated my position based on appearance, she continued, not raising her voice, not accusing, simply stating what had been evident to everyone now that the illusion had broken. I evaluated yours based on decisions. The distinction settled into the room with quiet clarity, sharper than any confrontation could have been. Daniel looked at her, truly looked at her now, but it was too late for recognition to change anything. And those decisions, Clara said, her gaze unwavering, no longer support the direction of this company. A faint sound echoed as someone shifted in their chair, the smallest movement suddenly loud in the stillness. Clara straightened slightly, her posture calm, composed, but undeniably firm. Your role is suspended pending board review, she said. The words did not rise, did not strike, but they landed with finality that could not be undone. Daniel froze, not in shock alone, but in the realization that the authority he had exercised so freely minutes ago had just been removed with the same simplicity. Around the table, no one spoke. No one intervened, because they understood now that the balance of power had not just shifted, it had been corrected. Clara allowed the silence to settle one last time, then stepped back slightly, her expression unchanged, her presence steady. And in that quiet, undeniable moment, the room no longer belonged to the man who had tried to control it, but to the woman who had never needed to. No one moved to stop her, not because they agreed, but because they no longer knew if they had the authority to. The shift had been too complete, too sudden, and now every instinct that once guided them felt unreliable. Daniel remained. Where he stood, the weight of Clara's words settling over him in a way he could not deflect or reinterpret. For a man who had built his identity on control, on certainty, on always being the one who decided what came next, this moment stretched longer than anything he had ever faced. "This is highly irregular," he said finally, though the statement lacked conviction, as if he were reaching for a rule that no longer applied. Clara's expression did not change. "So was your decision," she replied calmly. The response was immediate, measured, and left no room for argument. Around the table, a few executives shifted again, but this time not out of discomfort alone. There was something else now, something closer to alignment, as though they were recalibrating themselves to a new center of gravity. Clara turned her attention briefly to the far end of the table, where a senior legal advisor sat frozen, their phone still in hand. "You have received the directive?" she asked. The advisor nodded quickly, almost instinctively. "Yes, it is verified." The confirmation echoed quietly, but its impact was unmistakable. Clara gave a small nod, then looked back at Daniel. "Then we will proceed accordingly." Her tone carried no hostility, no satisfaction, just a quiet inevitability. Daniel exhaled slowly, his posture shifting again, not collapsing, but no longer rigid with authority. "Clara," he said, more carefully now, "you understand that a transition like this requires coordination. There are processes, approvals, already initiated." She interrupted, not sharply, but with precision that made the interruption final. The room absorbed that in silence. There would be no delay, no negotiation, no reversal. Clara reached for her phone once more, not hurried, not performative, simply continuing what had already begun. "Security will assist with access changes," she said, her voice even, as if discussing routine adjustments rather than the removal of power from the highest position in the room. A faint sound came from somewhere near the door as footsteps approached in the hallway beyond, subtle but unmistakable. The timing was exact. Daniel turned slightly toward the door, then back to Clara, and in that brief movement, something settled in his expression. Not acceptance, not yet, but recognition. He understood now that this was not a moment he could outmaneuver. This was not a negotiation he could win. This was the result of something far larger than the room he had once controlled. Clara met his gaze one last time, her eyes steady, unshaken, not unkind, but unmoved. "This company will continue," she said quietly, "just not the way it has been." The words did not accuse, but they carried truth that no one could deny. Around them, the room remained silent, but it was no longer the silence of confusion or disbelief. It was the silence of realization, of recalculation, of understanding that the hierarchy they had trusted had been an illusion built on incomplete knowledge. The door behind Clara opened softly, and the presence in the hallway paused, waiting, respectful, as if even they understood that the final moment belonged inside the room. Clara did not look back this time. She did not need to. She simply stepped forward, reclaiming her path with the same quiet certainty she had carried from the beginning. And behind her, the man who had once defined the room stood still, no longer leading, no longer deciding, only watching as the power he had mistaken for permanent slipped away without a single raised voice. The hallway outside waited in quiet readiness, but inside the room, time seemed to stretch, as if everyone understood that what happened next would define more than just titles or positions. Clara stepped fully past the threshold, then paused, not out of hesitation, but intention. The soft light from the corridor framed her silhouette for a brief moment before she turned back once more, her presence pulling every eye toward her again without effort. Behind her, two members of corporate security stood respectfully, not imposing, not urgent, simply present, their posture reflecting the same calm authority she carried. Daniel noticed them immediately, and in that instant, the final layer of denial fell away. This was no longer a discussion. This was execution of a decision already made. Clara's gaze moved across the room one last time, not searching for reactions, but acknowledging what remained. "There will be a board session scheduled within the next 24 hours, she said, her voice steady, measured, as if outlining the next step in a process that had been in motion long before this morning. "All current leadership roles will be evaluated based on performance and alignment." The words were not directed at anyone in particular, yet everyone felt them. Around the table, shoulders straightened, expressions tightened, and the quiet recalibration deepened into something more personal. This was no longer about one man losing power. It was about an entire system being seen clearly for the first time. Daniel took a slow breath, then another, as if grounding himself in something that had already shifted beyond his reach. "You planned this," he said, not with accusation, but with the quiet recognition of someone piecing together a truth too late. Clara did not deny it. She did not confirm it either. She simply met his gaze, her silence answering more honestly than words could. The room felt smaller now, not physically, but in the way authority had condensed, no longer spread across titles and positions, but centered in a single, unshaken presence. One executive cleared their throat softly, then stopped, unsure whether speaking was still appropriate. Another glanced at their screen again, rereading the directive as if hoping for a different outcome. There was none. Clara took a small step back into the hallway, her hand resting lightly against the doorframe. "Transition teams will reach out to each of you," she continued, her tone unchanged, calm, procedural, final. "Until then, no further decisions are to be made without approval." A faint echo followed her words, not from sound, but from the understanding that every action from this point forward would be measured differently. Daniel looked at her, really looked this time, not at her clothing, not at her role, but at the clarity in her presence, the quiet certainty he had mistaken for insignificance. "Clara," he said, her name softer now, stripped of authority, "this could have been handled differently." It was not a challenge. It was not even a defense. It was something closer to regret, though he had not fully allowed himself to feel it yet. Clara's expression remained steady, but there was a subtle shift in her eyes, not warmth, not sympathy, but understanding. "It was," she replied. The words were simple, but they carried the full weight of everything that had happened before this moment, everything that had been decided not in this room, but because of it. The room fell completely silent again, deeper than before, because now there was nothing left to interpret. No confusion, no doubt, just consequence. Clara gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, then turned fully toward the hallway. The door remained open for a second longer, as if allowing the final reality to settle in behind her. And then, without urgency, without force, she walked forward, leaving the room exactly as it was, only now stripped of the illusion that had once defined it. The door closed softly behind her, not with force, but with finality that echoed far louder than any sound it made. Inside the room, no one spoke at first. No one reached for their notes. No one resumed the meeting, because the structure they had relied on no longer existed in the way they understood it. The polished table, the tailored suits, the carefully arranged hierarchy all remained exactly as they had been, but something essential had shifted beneath it all. Daniel stood where he was, his phone still in his hand, though the screen had long gone dark. He did not move to follow her. He did not attempt to speak again. For the first time in years, perhaps longer, he had nothing left to assert, nothing left to control. Around him, the executives who had once looked to him for direction now avoided his gaze, not out of disrespect, but out of uncertainty, unsure where authority now truly rested, unsure how quickly the ground beneath them might change again. One by one, they began to gather their things, quietly, cautiously, as if any sudden movement might disrupt a balance that had only just been revealed. No one laughed. No one whispered. The room had learned something it could not unlearn. Minutes earlier, they had watched a woman be dismissed based on assumption, based on appearance, based on a hierarchy they believed was fixed. And now, they had watched that same hierarchy dissolve without resistance, without conflict, without a single raised voice. Daniel finally exhaled, a slow, measured breath, as he placed his phone onto the table. The gesture was small, but it marked something larger. The end of certainty. He looked toward the door, the same door she had walked through without hesitation, and for a brief moment, there was something in his expression that had not been there before. Not anger, not defiance, something quieter, something closer to understanding. He replayed the moment in his mind, the way she had sat, the way she had spoken, the way she had accepted his decision without argument. It had not been submission. It had been certainty, and he had mistaken it for weakness. Across the table, one of the executives finally spoke, their voice low, almost careful. "We should review the directive." It was not a suggestion. It was a recognition of what had already begun. Others nodded slowly, not in agreement with each other, but in alignment with something larger than themselves. The meeting would continue, but not as it had been. not under the same assumptions, not with the same certainty about who belonged at the top. Outside, the city moved as it always did, indifferent to the shift that had just taken place 42 floors above the street. Cars passed. People walked. Time did not pause. But inside that room, something had been rewritten in a way that would not be undone. Clara Whitmore did not need to raise her voice to be heard. She did not need to prove her power to those who had already dismissed her. She simply revealed what had always been true. And in doing so, she changed everything without ever needing to fight for it. The room went quiet once more, not out of tension this time, but out of understanding. Because that day, they did not just witness a reversal of power. They witnessed what happens when dignity does not demand recognition, but simply waits for the moment when the truth can no longer be ignored. And in that silence, heavier than any words that could have been spoken, the lesson settled in with quiet certainty. Power speaks loudly when it is insecure, but real power never needs to.